everyone, I'm Will Brown and welcome to the WPQuickies series, bite-sized WordPress tips and tricks in 30 minutes or less. And in this lunchtime quickies, I'm going to be talking about DNS records. So DNS, domains, DNS records. It's a bit of a confusing subject, so let's kind of whittle it down and try and explain it in a really simple manner. Okay, before we start, just some housekeeping. Remember to hit all the subscribe and bells and buttons and likes, whatever social channel that you're on. That'd be great. And while you're doing that, also drop your name, what you do, and where you're from down in the comments, and we'll give a shout out to you guys. We've got a Facebook group, so it's on Facebook, WordPress Sydney Meetup. You can go and search for that. A shout out to WPAustralia.org as well. And so if you're looking for a meetup across Australia, then go to WPAustralia.org and click on the Find a Meetup button. And there's also a Join Us on Slack button as well. This is for any WordPress admins. So if you are a web developer or designer, you look after and maintain client websites, have a look at wasg.com.au. It can really help boost your recurring revenue for that. And the next in-person monthly evening meetings, this is the big evening meetups. We're going back in person, which is great, the Microsoft Reactor just at Wynyard. So I'm going to be talking about WordPress and automation. So some of the things you can do with WordPress, some things that you can automate. I'll go through several tools they can use and some examples for those as well. But the best part is it's in person. We actually get to meet people and eat pizza and chat to people one-to-one, which is fantastic. We are trying to reboot the WordPress Sydney meetup community. It got a bit decimated during COVID, but you know, we've got a few people that are starting to trickle back, which is fantastic. Okay, I'm always looking for topics, so I can queue up some topics for the rest of the year for those. So if you can think of some topics that can maybe be 20 minutes, around about 20 minutes for discussion and a little bit of a Q&A, fill out that Google Forms, a QR code as well. You can do that later on as well. I'm always asked about links. All the links are posted to the video descriptions at the meetup page after the stream. And please, you know, feel free to ask questions in the chat box during. Okay, who we got online? We've got Feature Shock from Marrickville. We've got Joey J from Singapore. We've got Robbie. Hey, thought you'd pop in for a quickie. Hey, Robbie. Nice to meet you. Robbie's up in Port Macquarie. Thanks very much for joining us. I'm going to dive in to this subject because it is a little bit complicated and I'm going to try and explain it as simple as I can. Hopefully I can. So let's jump into it right now. Okay, so what are domain names? Let's start at the very start. Like, just if you haven't even know what domains are before, let's start at the very beginning. Because before you can understand DNS, you really need to understand what domain names are. Now, I know a lot of you probably understand what domain names are, but let's just start from the beginning. Now, domain names are the human understandable addresses to any service on the internet. Could be a PC, could be a SaaS service, anything like that, but it's the human understandable name to get to that service on the internet. So for example, google.com, youtube.com, abc.net.au, and willbrown.com, which is my new personal brand website. Shameless plug, thank you very much. But those are the human ones. So we can understand those things. We can remember those things. We can remember google.com. We can remember YouTube and stuff. Now, DNS stands for Domain Name System, and this is the system that translates all those human understandable domain names into machine understandable Internet Protocol or IP addresses. Now we've got a couple of examples up here. So a little robot in the middle, he's having a conversation with his buddy on the left-hand side. And the first address there is an IP version 4. So basically that's the one that we all kind of understand. This is one that we all kind of know. We see in computers, we see it in web browsers, we see it in all this sort of stuff. So this is the 4-digit address. So for example, the one up here is 172.75.127.3. Each of these numbers can go from 0 all the way up to 255. And that was great maybe 10 years ago. But nowadays, we have so many devices, so many smart devices connected to the internet, and they all need an internet protocol address, so you can get them individually. Now, we're kind of transgressing into this IP version 6. And that's the one underneath. So this is the 2001:0DB8. And the reason that we moved to this address is that the IP4 addresses are kind of almost used up. Because there's billions of devices, there's probably going to be billions more that will come online in the next 10 years. So we need more room, bigger addresses to cater for all those different devices. Now, you may stand a chance of remembering an IP version 4 address. You might remember a few digits from those, but there is no way that you're going to be able to understand and remember those IP6 addresses unless you've got like an eidetic memory or something like that. Just look at them, they're so long, they're so complicated, there's no way you're going to remember all of those for those. Now, put that aside, computers can quite happily chat to each other using all these addresses, using all these IPs. They don't need these human domain names for reference. They can just quite happily speak in machine language. So DNS is completely for us humans. Facebook user, somebody's saying the YouTube link isn't working. It is because I've got it here on my little screen on my laptop. Look, here it is down there. Definitely working. Definitely working. Maybe try refreshing and see if that works for you. Okay. Okay, so how does DNS work? So we can really simplify DNS by looking at 4 critical points. So these are your computer, your ISP, that's your internet service provider, your root name server, and the authoritative name server. So let's have a look at each of these. Okay, so your computer is, of course, your computer in your office, in your house, on your kitchen table, wherever it is, connected to the internet. So that's pretty easy to understand. Okay, so it's not working. That's no problem. It's all recorded. So if you can't watch the live one, then you'll be able to watch the recording on YouTube later. Sorry about that. Okay, so a recursive name server. So this is the one on the ISP. Recursive name server, it's a bit of a mouthful, is the first stop in a DNS query. So this is the human names. This is the system that's looking up. So usually it's a server used by your internet service provider, your ISP. The recursive resolver acts as kind of a middleman between the client, that could be a web browser or your local computer, and the DNS name server that's got the human names. After receiving a DNS query from a web client, the recursive name server will either respond with a cached bit of data, so it remembers, it's got it cached, it knows what that address, what that IP is, and it will send that back for that. Or if the cache is out of date, the data is out of date, if it's expired, then it will send a request to something called a root name server, followed by another request to a top-level domain name server, and then one last request to an authoritative name server. And we'll go through some of these when we in the next few slides. Now, after receiving a response from the authoritative name server containing the IP address, the recursive resolver then sends a response back to the client to say, here's the address, go and do your stuff. Now, your domain name's name server, they're likely to be within your website ISP server, but they could also belong to a CDN. For example, Cloudflare, a CDN is a content delivery network. So you might have to look at your ISP, you might have to look at Cloudflare, depending on what services you're using. But for most of the people, then it's going to be on your website, on your ISP's system. Okay, so root servers, they are DNS name servers that operate in what we call the root domain. So when we're looking at domain names, we're looking at what they call the top-level domain. So that's the .org, the .com, the .net, that, for example. These root servers act on that sort of level. So these servers can directly answer queries for records stored or cached within what we call this root zone. And they can also refer other requests to appropriate top-level domain servers. But we're really starting at the .com to .net and kind of working our way backwards, so you can see from the flowchart there. So for example, find a .com, and then it'll find a google.com, and then it might find a subdomain like maps.google.com. The guy who invented the internet, he actually says, if it could change one thing, that it would probably reverse the way that websites addresses are run. So it'd be like com.google.maps, because that's kind of the logical way that these servers are looking for it. But this is the root server, so it handles these top-level domains and all the subdomains underneath. Okay, so root name servers. They are only 13 root server IP addresses, keeping the whole internet traffic flowing. And they are maintained by 12 independent organizations. Now, it doesn't just mean there's 13 servers that are guarded, with guns and stuff like that. There's only 13 addresses, root address name servers, but there's lots of different instances of those. In fact, at any one time, there's usually around about 1,500, maybe 1,600 instances of these 13 root servers to handle all the traffic at any one time. Now, the Internet Corporation for Assigned Names and Numbers, that's ICANN, they operate servers for just one of the IP addresses. So ICANN kind of looks after most of the domain name registrations at kind of really top level. So they are responsible for just one of those root name servers. Another company or organization called VeriSign, one of the big comm giants, they are the only organization out of those 12 that actually operates two root IP addresses, two root servers and their instances. Now, if you want more information about that, then you can go to root-servers.org, and I'll copy that down here. And it shows you a little map, roughly where they are. Some of them are a bit secret, and who kind of operates them and some information about those as well. Okay, so let's look at the last one, which is the Authoritative DNS server. Now, this is the final holder of the IP address of the domain name your computer is requesting for. It's the final DNS result that's sent back to the initial requester. So suppose your ISP's recursive name server finds a record that's sent back for an IP address is outdated. In that case, what it does, it eventually asks an authoritative name server for the actual IP address. So an authoritative server is likely to be a server, again, at the ISP, where you registered your domain name, actually your DNS record for those. Here's how it kind of works. So this is like kind of the whole internet DNS process lookup. So we can see here, step one, the user types in, for example, example.com, or it could be your website.com into a web browser, and the query travels into the internet and is received by a DNS resolver. Now, the DNS resolver, it queries the DNS root name server. So this is looking for the .com first, and then it's going to tell it where the .com is, and then the example part of that. The next one is the root server responds to the resolver with the address of the top level domain, TLD, DNS server such as the .com or .net, which stores the information for its domains. Now, when searching for example.com, our request is pointed towards the .com top level domain server. Okay, number 4, the resolver makes a request to that particular server, the .com top level domain server, and then the next thing is that server, the TLD server, then responds with the IP address of the domain name server that is looking after example.com. Lastly, the recursive resolver sends that query to the domain's name server for the IP address. And then the IP address for example.com is then returned to the resolver, DNS resolver, for that particular name server. And step 8 is the DNS resolver then responds to the web browser, and it gives it that IP address of the domain that was initially requested. So that's all this sort of stuff is just for, all that stuff is for humans. Just give me the machine address from this human domain name. Now, once these 8 steps of the DNS lookup have returned the IP address for example.com, the browser can start making requests for that web page using the IP address. So this is where the machines start talking to each other. Sounds a bit like Terminator. This is what happens. Step 9, last 2 processes, the browser makes an HTTPS request to the IP address. So now we're dumping the whole domain system because it's no longer human-to-human, it's computer. And the last step here, number 10, the server at that IP address returns the web page and all the data so that the client can then render the web page. So that's it. That's the 10-step DNS lookup process, 8-step DNS lookup process to change that human domain name into an IP address. And then the 2 following queries just starts, the machines are talking to each other. So hopefully that's given you a little bit more understanding of the whole kind of domain DNS lookup process. Okay, So now we kind of understand the lookup process. Let's have a little bit of a look into DNS records. Now, each domain name can hold different bits of data associated with that particular domain name. It can provide information about a domain, including what IP addresses are associated with the domain and how to handle requests for other mappings. Now, these records consist of a series of files written in what's known as DNS syntax. So in the previous example, we looked at an IP address mapping to a domain name. This is just one type of a DNS record, and it's called an A record, but there are many, many more. So here are the most common types of DNS records that you're probably likely going to use or come across when you're dealing with your WordPress websites, with your clients, maybe your client migrations or production launches, that sort of stuff. And so an A record that holds the IP address. It's the IP4 address. This is the 4 numbers with dots in them. That's the address for the mapping of your domain name to your web server. So for example, example.com that we're looking at, the IP address of the actual machine that it needs to go to, that's what would be held in the DNS record for an A record. The next one is a AAA record. Now, a AAA record, that records the IP version 6 address for a domain. Now, your ISP might not use IP version 6 yet. It was started to roll out maybe about 5 years ago. It's kind of slowed down. Some people are quick on uptake. Some people aren't. It just really depends on the ISP and the comm giant that's looking after that, if they implement those or not. But the quadruple A, that's the IP version 6 address for that domain name to the web server. The next one that you might come across is something called a CNAME. Now, a CNAME, it doesn't actually provide an IP address, but what it's used for forwarding domain names or subdomains to another domain. So you might use this, for example, if you're mapping services, such as maybe an LMS service or an accounting service to your own domain or subdomain. So for example, I have courses.willbrown.com. mapped to my Fresh Learn LMS account. So I've got a learning management system. I run some courses, and this allows me, the CNAME allows me to map courses.willbrown.com back over to the LMS system. So it kind of looks as if it's running under my domain, but it's not really, because it's running under the Fresh LMS domain. Okay, so that's CNAME records. The next one is MX records. MX records, they detail email servers. For those, so that's pretty simple. The next one is text records, or TXT records. So text records lets the domain name admins store text notes against the DNS record. Now, these results are often used for domain and email security. So for example, if you're setting up Google Analytics or Google Search Console for your website, for your client websites, it's probably going to ask you at the very beginning, are you the owner of that domain? Okay, prove it. And one of the ways to prove that, other than uploading an HTML file to the domain name, is to go into the DNS record and add a text record with a verification code for that, and then refresh Google, and it will look at the DNS, it'll pull out the text record. If it matches, then it says, yep, fine, you actually own that domain because you've been able to update it. The next one is NS. So NS is the name server. This is where it stores the name server IP address for that, and that's used in that DNS query with the human name to machine name to find out exactly which is the server that's holding the information for that particular domain name. Now, there are heaps and heaps of more DNS entries. Those are just the common ones. So I've sent a link in the chat there. It's a Cloudflare document. It's very, very good, very detailed. It goes through all the additional DNS records, some of the kind of more bizarre ones for those. But you can have a look at that at your leisure. Okay, so here is a screenshot. I'll get rid of myself. Here's a screenshot of my DNS records. This is the willbrown.com DNS records. So we can see here at the top, I've spoofed out some of the IP addresses just in case you guys are going to bot attack me, and hopefully you wouldn't. But there we can see here. So they're nicely color coded, so you can see the different types here. So we've got 2 A records. So we've got one for willbrown.com, and then we've got one for www.willbrown.com. I use the naked domain, not the www. But you can see here, we've got the host name, we've got the value, that's the IP version 4 address, and then we've got a few other bits and bobs, which I'll talk about in a little bit right there. But we've got 2 CNAMEs. So you can see I've got two CNAMEs on my my domain. One is to sales, so that actually links to my Thrive cart. That's my kind of sales page, sales landing page. And then I've got courses.willbrown.com, and that goes to Fresh Learn, or used to be called Fresh LMS. I guess I've not changed the domain names. You can see here that I've got MX records. Those are the ones in blue. So I'm using Google Mail or G Suite for my mail. So that's all the Google Mail records for those. Then in the orange or yellow, we've got the name servers, and that basically points the willbrown.com domain name to the particular name server that tries to resolve the IP address. And down below, we've got one text record example, the one in green right at the very bottom, and it is a Google site verification. That was probably when I was setting up Google Analytics or Google Search Console, and I popped that in the DNS record just to verify that I am the owner for that. So that's kind of what your DNS records are going to look like. The interface will probably change a little bit depending on which host that you are logging into, but the data is roughly the same. So top domain tips. So we've kind of run through the DNS sequence, resolve. We've kind of looked at a little bit about DNS records. Here are my 3 top tips when handling domain names. Tip number 1 is when you register a domain name, make sure that you use a generic admin email address, such as maybe admin@ or hello@ or support@. Now, domain name registrars, that's the companies that you register your domain name with. Those companies, they're only going to send out a domain name renewal notification to the administrative email address stored in that domain record. So, for example, if maybe marketing director Kevin registers the company domain name using his kevin.smith@example.com, or even worse, kevinsmith@gmail.com address, and perhaps he leaves the company, and then a couple of years later, when the domain name comes up for renewal, those emails are just going to bounce because that address is no longer accessible for that. And that could result in that domain expiring and that company losing that particular domain name. So my biggest tip when you're looking at domain names is to make sure that you got the administrative email as an admin, a generic admin. So like an inbox that your company can share, or an inbox that doesn't change, that somebody can get access to, it can get passed to from person to person. Don't make it a personal address. My tip number 2 is for domain names. So when it comes to domain names, the golden rule generally is shorter names are better than longer ones, but try to avoid a collection of letters unless your brand is already established. So for example, we've got some fictitious ones here. For a company, Xavier's All Year Zorbing Company, they're looking for a new domain name. Now, they could choose xayz.com. It's really, really short. It's somewhat memorable. But if people don't associate that XAYZ with their current brand, if that's not what comes to their mind, then that's going to be pretty useless for that. Yes, it's short, but if it's not brand aware, then it's going to be completely useless for that company. Now, you could try Xavier's allyearzorbing.com. It's very detailed. It says exactly what it says, but it's a bit too long and it's a bit too confusing to the eye. And really, I see the word Sally in the middle, Sally Year in the middle, which is a little bit confusing. It's a little bit too long, a little bit too long-winded. Can you imagine trying to say that over the phone? People are probably going to not be able to download that or get that one properly. So the last example is Xavier's Zorbing. It's a bit of alliteration for those, Xavier's Zorbing, even though it's an X. For that, but it's kind of short, to the point, it kind of works pretty well. So here are some reasons why shorter domain names are better than longer domain names. One is they're easier to include in business cards and other printed promotional materials. Can you imagine if you had a long, big, Xavier's allyearzorbing.com? It's pretty long. It's going to take up a long area in your printed material. Shorter ones are obviously easier to read and they're easier to remember. And they're more accessible as well, typing in on mobile. Now, nobody likes to type stuff in mobile, especially not long domain names like Xavier's All Year Zorbing. Okay, forget it. So, all those, try and think about your domain names. Generally, shorter is better, but if you go in super short, make sure it's brand aware. Kind of avoid the big, long ones because they're a bit of a pain to type in. Now, last tip for this one is keywords in a domain name do not affect Google SEO results. They're helpful for us humans only. So if you're thinking about keywords, yes, they're helpful for us, to remember or to kind of relate to exactly what that domain name is, maybe what that company does. But from an SEO results, from a search page point of view, Google does not look at keywords in a domain. So bear that in mind. Okay, tip number 3 is if you're thinking about registering a domain name for your business, make sure it passes the over-the-phone test before you commit to buying. It's a really simple test to do. It doesn't need to be over the phone. You could just ask a friend. But basically, call a friend, ask a friend, and tell them to write down what you say next. So, and then you will say the domain name. You say your proposed domain name, just in a regular conversational tone. And then if your friend asks any questions back regarding the spelling, the pronunciation, or anything else, then you might want to rethink that domain name. Now, my first couple of businesses, domain names choices were a complete disaster. I'm not going to tell you what they were, but I would have to spell them out letter by letter, phonetically, out over the phone. So things like, Alpha, Bravo, Charlie, Uniform, Victor, that just so that people could understand what it was. So you probably want to avoid that hassle for yourself and for your client as well. Okay, so some common questions that we get asked regarding domain names and DNS is, how can I find my domain name registrar? Now, some domain owners, they may forget which organization, which registrar that they originally bought or registered the domain name from, or maybe the information just wasn't recorded down and, the person who registered it has long gone, and now you're looking to update it or to move it and you don't know where it is. So there are a couple of places that you can try out. One is ICANN, so lookup.icann.org. It's a little bit ropey. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. But you can generally go on to ICANN there and then put in your domain name, and it will have a look at all the servers and try and pull out as much information as it can. Another one is Whois, so that's just who.is, exactly the same sort of process. Probably get a little bit better results than I can. And another one is this whole collection of domain tools. So it's whois.domaintools.com. But if you have a look at domaintools.com, it's got some really good tools there for managing domains. But definitely Whois, and it's pretty much the same as the who.is, but it's just controlled by a different server. Now, the registrant, that's the company, the owner maybe of the domain name. They may have domain privacy switched on. So you may not be able to get any company or registration information per se about the actual owner, but there should be some clues there for you to go and hunt down who the registrar is. So here is an example for this. This is the Whois record for my domain, willbrown.com. For there. Now you can see there's lots of information. I've got privacy turned on for those. So you can see kind of maybe halfway down, it says registrant name, domain privacy for those. But we can kind of see there's a little bit of information there. We can see that there's an abuse email for those. There's a one at nexigen.digital, and then there's a no reply at ventra.ip.com.ap as a reseller. So there's a little bit of information there for that. So you can see that, we can see those kind of two companies, nexigen.digital and Ventra IP. And that's enough information for you to send an inquiry to those companies, trying to hunt down the domain name, and then you have to go through the process of proving that you are the person who owns that for that. But that's kind of a way, those services there, you can try and figure out, who owns or where to go to get that information to try and reclaim your DNS records. Okay, the next question I get asked is, how can I update my domain name server? So for example, if you're moving different web hosts, different ISPs, and then you're going to likely have to change the name server because it points to them rather than your old company. So every company has a slightly different interface, but it's usually just a simple form. It's a field editor type thing. Name servers are usually updated a little bit different from the other DNS records, the one that we looked before with the A records, just because they're kind of pretty important. If you mess up your name server, then it's going to the wrong server and it's not going to bring back the IP address. So you'll usually find name servers in a tab that's update name servers, custom name servers, things like that. So this image here shows the name server editor for willbrown.com domain, and this is on the Ventra IP. I've got mine registered through Ventra IP. So in this here, the previous records that you saw was under the DNS hosting, and this one is under a custom tab called custom name servers. Okay, and last question is, how do you point my domain to another ISP's web server? Obviously, very, very common, people moving around all the time. So if you do move your WordPress website to another ISP, you're going to have to change your DNS records and possibly your quadruple A records to point to a new web server's IP address, because it's going to be a different address than your old ISP. Now, the image shows the edit field for the A record that maps my www.willbrown.com domain to an IP address of the web server. Note that every DNS record has something called a TTL. So that's the number on the far right, TTL, and it stands for time to live. And this is the amount of time that the DNS servers cache that information. And then once that time has expired, then they go through that whole resolution thing. They look at the TLD, the root name, the authoritative to get that actual IP address, because it could have changed within that particular time period. So it's probably a good idea to lower that number if you want faster updates to, if you're moving to a new web server, lower it down to something and then change it back up to the original after the DNS is replicated. In this example, it's got a TTL of 86,400 seconds, and that equates to 1 day. So you might want to lower that down to maybe an hour or maybe 30 minutes or something like that, and then wait for it to synchronize and then put that back up. Another question, I think this is the last one, is do I need to use www with my domain name? No, you don't. That is your choice. It doesn't really matter. www stands for World Wide Web. You can probably ditch that because everyone knows it's www now, and use the naked domain. I prefer to use naked domains. I get rid of www. If you are doing this, then make sure you choose one method and stick with it, and make sure you map the other one over to one to the other, because URLs are totally unique. So for example, Google Analytics, Google Search Console, they will see www.willbrown.com and willbrown.com as two separate entities. And if you don't redirect one to the other, then you're probably going to lose half your data for that. And also remember to update the WordPress settings in general to the proper address field as well. So if you're using naked domains, which I am, this is the general settings from my willbrown.com website. You can see here I've got the two URLs. I've just got the willbrown.com, I've dropped the www. So make sure that matches with your preference, because if you have www in there, then that's what WordPress is going to start generating, and you're probably going to lose all that traffic information in Google. Okay, so DNS is a bit complicated, so I've overrun a little bit by a couple of minutes, but understand the basics, I think, is going to really help you become more competent in handling client website launches and migrations, kind of really knowing what's going on with this DNS records. There are a couple of questions. I'll try and pull them up and answer them just now. Joey J says, what do you think about a bunch of new top-level domains like .news, .photography? Do you use it for yourself or your clients? It's a really, really good question, and it's quite relevant, because just last month, possibly last month, probably months before, they launched a new .au domain. So a new top level for Australia was .au, and everyone did a big rush to try and grab it from those. So what do you think about using them? It's really a personal preference. From a Google Analytics, a Google SEO point of view, it doesn't particularly matter what your top level domain is. They kind of treat them all the same. So you don't get any more points for using a .com than using like a .au or .net or .info. It's really kind of a personal choice for those. But from a human point of view, I think people are kind of conditioned to use .com nowadays. Certainly in Australia or in America, they're very, very conditioned just to find out what a .com is. Maybe if in the UK, you're probably more conditioned to use a .co.uk. In Ireland, for example, most people would search for .ie if they're looking for local stuff. But yeah, so you have to kind of weigh it up, balance the pros and cons. New domains, it might not be relevant to people's brains. They might not be thinking to type a .news or a .photography. But if you're marketing it, if you've got it on your information, your business card, your brochures, then and your brand, if that's what your brand uses, then that is fine. Just stick with that and go for it. So there's no good answer. There's no particular advantage from a search SEO point of view. It's just more from a kind of human point of view that you're going to be looking to use those new top level domains. Somebody on Facebook says, I have just registered a new domain name that I want to just direct to my canonical URL. How do I do that? That's a really good question as well. So you probably, when you're registering domain names under your brand, you probably want to snap up, a few of the kind of popular top level domains. So for example, if you got your name as .com, you probably want to snap up .net, maybe .Sydney. If you're in Australia, you might want to get the .au as well. And you want to make sure that all those redirect to that one main, the primary domain name that you have. And the way you do that is within your ISP, your internet service provider. So here you'll be able to log in into cPanel, you'll be logging into Plesk, for example, and you want to do something called domain mapping, or it could be part domain. So it's kind of two sort of things. And all you're really doing in here is it's an interface that's basically updating your DNS records for those. But you want to go into part domains, you want to go into those sort of things, and it allows you to map a particular domain name, and it just changes the A record for that DNS record back to the server for those. Most of the interfaces will actually do a mapping as well. So once you're adding this stuff into cPanel, into your part domains, your mapping domains, it'll probably add a little entry to .htaccess that then when someone's typing in willbrown.au, then the server will say, okay, I'm going to map that to willbrown.com for that. Now, if you're not using Plesk, if you're not using cPanel, that little step probably isn't going to happen. So if you have parked your domains, if you've mapped your domains within your ISP, within your cPanel, and it's still not working, then the next step you'd have to do is then update your .htaccess on the server, or go into your Nginx configuration and do that mapping between the dot whatever it is back to your primary domain for those. Mr. Merbius, I'll take this as the last question because I've run over a little bit. Do you prefer to have your host handle DNS or third parties like Amazon, Route 53, or DNS Made Easy? I prefer to handle them myself rather than third parties. However, I do have clients that are on Amazon, and they, of course, they use the Route 53 as well. For myself, it adds more complication, or it adds more complexity onto the system. Because as well as the actual DNS records, you're now having to manage another service that is managing the DNS for those. Now, if you're scaling stuff up using Amazon systems, if you've got like multiple load balancers, if you've got multiple database systems, then yes, they all kind of work together and they map it all out nicely. And that might work for your setup. But if you're just having like a normal, that's not a good word. If a regular website where you've just got like an ISP, so maybe you're running on Flywheel, maybe you're running on Kinetics, something like that, then you're probably not going to use like any sort of extra service. Just go into your DNS service provider, update CNAME, maybe update an A record or AAA record, and that's it done until the next time you're moving different providers. So unless you're really actively adding stuff to DNS and kind of really using all these different like load balancing servers and all that sort of stuff, then I don't think a DNS system is kind of worth that complexity for that. So hopefully that's answered your question there. Okay, final question. Do you use Venture IP to host your website? A little bit off topic. No, I don't. I use Wordify.com. So I moved over to Wordify maybe about 3 years ago for those. Really, really good. If you are a developer, then they basically offer, I think it's unlimited free staging sites. And they've got like 2 GB of space. So you can basically host all your development or staging sites on them for completely free. And that's really, really useful if you're doing client stuff and you want to show your clients, all this sort of stuff. It's password protected as well. So Google doesn't index it for all that sort of stuff. So yeah, I use Wordify.com for all my sites. Okay, last one. Miss Bamboo says, I swapped to DNS Made Easy as it can read it. As I read it, can help with the time to first byte, which I find to be true. Okay, so yeah, there's basically 2 types of DNS lookups. There's the one that everyone uses, and there's like the really super fast one. And that's on things like Google. It's on things like Microsoft as well. It's like a premium DNS resolver. So you get it on these big host things like Kinsta, like WP Engine, like Flywheel, and it just makes it a little bit quicker for those. But they pay for that sort of stuff. So I don't use that, and I've not got any problems with my time to first byte. Okay, guys, thank you so much. I kind of overrun by 10 minutes. Sorry about that. I'm trying to make it as quick as possible, but DNS is a little bit of a tricky thing to try and explain. There we go. There's my connection details. I'll leave that on the screen for a few seconds and then you can watch it later on if you haven't connected with me already. I'm mostly on LinkedIn, so have a look at me on there. Next week on WPQuickies, I am going to be looking at custom logging screens. So if you are looking to wow your clients, looking to brand your client's website a little bit more than just the regular WordPress login screen, then I really do recommend that you go this kind of extra effort and customize those login screens for your clients and for your own websites as well. So that's what we're looking at next week on WP Quickies. Thank you very much for bearing with me on this longer WP Quickies. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you guys in next week. Ciao, ciao.